Olá, eu sou o Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. A entrevista que estamos a publicar faz parte de uma investigação em que estamos a trabalhar há quase 4 anos, em parceria com a revista digital de jornalismo narrativo Divergente. Uma investigação sobre brutalidade policial, discriminação na justiça e o que significa ser polícia em Portugal, que podes ir acompanhando a partir de hoje em fumaca.pt/as-polícias-em-Portugal. As polícias em Portugal. Para quem não decorou o link, que não é fácil, deixo-o também na descrição do episódio de hoje, na tua app de podcasts. Como podes ver nessa página, estamos a escrever o 5º episódio de 12. Podes também ouvir um trecho do ambiente sonoro que vamos dar à série. Última nota. Na próxima quarta-feira, dia 24 deste mês, temos pela primeira vez uma sessão do Inquietações ao vivo, desde a nossa redação, em Lisboa. Vamos discutir o artigo Mocambo, o antigo bairro africano de Lisboa, ainda está dentro de nós, publicado pela jornalista Andreia Friaças, no Público. Se ainda não fazes parte da comunidade, vais a tempo de juntar-te ao nosso clube de discussão, dia 24, pelas 16h30, e se não estiveres em Lisboa, podes juntar-te online. Basta para isso criares uma contribuição mensal em fumaca.pt/contribuir. Agora sim, fica com a entrevista a Alex S. Vitale. Até já. Seja toda a gente bem-vindo ao Fumaça, o meu nome é Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Hoje tenho comigo Alex S. Vitale, professor de Sociologia e coordenador do projeto Policiamento e Justiça Social do City University of New York, Graduate Center, e do Brooklyn College, nos Estados Unidos da América. É também autor do livro The End of Policing. Esta entrevista será em inglês. Welcome to Fumaça, Alex.
You're most welcome.
What's the role of the police?
Well, the role of the police is to produce order. But that order doesn't just automatically benefit everyone equally. That's a kind of liberal myth about policing, is that the police enforce the law, produce order in a way that's good for everyone. But the idea of order that they're producing is rooted in systems of inequality. So we see the emergence of policing mostly in the 19th century around the primary mechanisms of exploitation during that period, which are colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization. And policing manage both the formal and informal resistance to those regimes, labor strikes, anti-colonial movements, but also disorderly and what we often describe as criminal behavior by those who've been left out of those systems of exploitation or who've been subjected to them. So police don't manage predatory lending practices by banks. They don't manage the environmental pollution by industrial corporations. They manage the small disorderly behaviors of the very poor, those who've been left out of the global economy, those who have no place to sleep at night, migrants, people without papers. And so the function of the police is to produce an order that benefits those who are at the winning end of those systems of exploitation.
In Portugal, the first police force was created in 1867. It was called the Polícia Civil de Lisboa. Portuguese historian Maria João Vaz told us in an interview, and I'm quoting, "The creation of the police corresponds to the will of the state to exert its power over a territory and the people. Clearly, the state is dominated by the elites, so its will is the will of those elites to dominate and control the rest of the population." Globally, was this true?
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that, of course, before that, there were Portuguese forms of policing. They just weren't in Portugal, right? They were in Brazil. They were in parts of Africa. They were in parts of, South Asia. And they often had a more military character to them, in part because they didn't need to produce the same level of legitimacy in the eyes of colonial populations as they did here in the metropole, in the home countries, in the home area of Europe. So much of the most brutal, aggressive, violent policing happens in this colonial context away from the European metropole, which is very different than the United States, where our colonialism and our slavery actually happens domestically.
It's settler colonialism.
Yes, and so this is one of the reasons why the U.S. is a so much more violent society with so much more of an emphasis on guns and violent policing, because that is much more directly our history.
But why is... I've been also looking for a lot of that history of the police or police forces, or even things that then led to the police forces outside of Portugal in the ex-colonized territories. But there is a big lack of historic knowledge on that front. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're absolutely right. There is a real limit in the amount of underlying data, historical narratives, documents, and then even where some of that material exists, it hasn't been fully explored. I think part of it is because it goes against the kind of liberal, legal formalist myth-making around policing. And it imagines that colonialism and slavery are these completely separate processes that involve military power and or paramilitary policing, and therefore is somehow not relevant. But of course, when we look carefully at the histories that do exist, when we look at the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, for instance, we see just how integrated this foreign anti-colonial policing is with domestic policing, the sharing of technology, techniques, and even individuals who move back and forth to manage these systems. Some of the best information is actually contained in military histories because there's much better documentation, and we learn more about some of the individuals and projects, and we are exposed to this kind of gray area between military conquest and police management of these colonial possessions.
If that's all true, so if this story about the history of police is true, is the term police violence a redundancy? Does police require violence?
It is a redundancy. Yeah, police are violence workers. Nicole Siegel has an excellent book about this fundamental nature of policing as rooted in the authorization and capacity to mobilize violence under the cover of state legitimacy. And so that legitimacy part of it is important. So it can't be completely illegitimate violence, or it will produce political problems. And so let's go back to the question of colonialism, right? So what we see in many cases is that colonial conquest begins with overt direct military power. But as soon as territory is taken and armed organized resistance is stabilized, the military will be replaced by some form of policing, which will even utilize people from the local population under the command of colonial leadership, whether it's British police in Kenya or whatever. So that form of policing of violence is rooted in efforts to both save money and produce more legitimacy. So it quickly attempts to associate itself with the rule of law and to say, we are here to fight crime, to enforce the law, and then producing a discourse that justifies those legal systems, even though that law is central to the colonial project, excluding some from the right to own property, to have any political voice, right, and protecting the exploitative property rights of the colonial population, of the colonizing population. And so whenever they can reduce the overt violence, they will try to do that because that always gives them more leverage to increase their legitimacy and acceptance, and it requires less political effort.
The last report of the CPT, the Council of Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture, about Portugal after the 2019 visit reads, "The findings of the CPT's delegation appear to indicate that the infliction of ill treatment, particularly on persons of African descent and foreign nationals, is not infrequent. The Portuguese authorities must recognize that the existence of ill treatment by police officers is a fact and that it is not a result of a few rogue officers." We've interviewed Julia Cosma, the head of delegation, who told us that Portugal has one of the most violent police forces of the Western Europe. Does that surprise you?
Well, I can't speak so specifically to what might differentiate Portugal from other European powers. Obviously, there are problems in Spain with the policing of migrants, and we see even problems in France and the Netherlands and Belgium with the policing of migrant populations.
And you're only naming ex-imperial
Western
powers.
European ex-imperial powers. And of course, one of the ironic, if you will, elements of this, right, is that part of what's happening here is that we continue to have neo-colonial forms of exploitation, but part of the production of legitimacy of those forms of exploitation has been some improvement in the ability of people to move between countries. And so that means that the European countries have had to take in more migrants, either with papers or as refugees or even illegally, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Undocumented in some sense, right? Well, outside the law. I think it's okay to say outside the law because I don't accept the legitimacy of those legal regimes. So they are, in essence, illegal because the law is unjust in this matter. But this openness that is always limited, right? As we saw in Spain a couple of weeks ago, their willingness to use violence to keep people out.
You're talking about Melilla, like
yes, exactly.
Where dozens of migrants were
killed. Yes, and so the violence is increasingly being brought into the European countries because they're importing, in a sense, their social problems that they produced internationally, and they are caught in a contradiction between a liberal ideology of openness and growing economic insecurity and xenophobia domestically. And so this is producing all kinds of racist backlashes. And policing is at the front end often of these processes, in part because their notion of order is rooted in a history of racial exclusion and their kind of connection to a conservative working class outlook that's been undermined, decentered by growing economic insecurity as they lose their kind of dominant place in the global economy.
But what you're trying to suggest is that because these countries, and in particular Portugal, was a colonial power because, it pioneered transatlantic trade of enslaved people 5 centuries ago. Is that what you're suggesting is that it was bound to happen, that the police forces are violent and are racist?
It's not that it was bound to happen per se, because Portugal could have taken a different track in the post-colonial period, which
happened just like less than 50 years ago.
Yes, but it could have moved to engage in some form of reparations. It could have had a kind of social reckoning around its role in colonialism that might have produced more social acceptance. But instead, it tried to wall itself off in many ways and continued in some ways a process of corporate exploitation of these former colonies, continuing to pull wealth out and to support often undemocratic regimes that facilitated that wealth extraction. Now, Portugal's not unique in this. The Belgians, the French, the English all engage and the Americans in similar processes. But all of this has contributed to a hardening of attitudes around race, migration status, and an intensification of domestic policing.
In 2021, the Portuguese Ministry of Internal Affairs announced its plan for the prevention of signs of discrimination in law enforcement. It's originally entitled Plano de Prevenção de Manifestações, Discriminação nas Forças e Serviços de Segurança. That's in Portuguese. The plan includes a reform of recruiting strategies, making it more diverse. Some tactics are already in place, including rules on the hiring of more women and more people from territories, quote, representative of diverse social and cultural backgrounds. Do women or non-white law enforcement officers engage in less ill treatment?
Well, there's some evidence that women do create an improved environment. There is less violence and a little less reliance on arrests. And that's a fairly robust finding across countries, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. However, that is always rooted in the reality of women making up a fairly small percentage of policing. And I'm not sure that those marginal improvements in policing that we get with some marginal increase in female officers can translate into, well, if we had 60% female officers, policing would look totally different. Because I think policing would still be under pressure to produce order through the mobilization of violence. And women officers would be under pressure to clear migrants out of that park, clear homeless people off that street corner, disperse youth who are being disorderly in a particular plaza. And they might first try verbal persuasion, but if that is unsuccessful, when push comes to shove, literally, they will have to mobilize violence because that is the mission that the political leadership has given them to accomplish. And increasing gender diversity or racial diversity is unlikely to produce the kinds of robust improvements in policing that people often hope for. And I'll just say again that police in Nigeria and Kenya under British rule were local Black populations. The early police in Brazil were indigenous populations, a mix of indigenous, mestizo, right? They were diverse as the colonial power tried to turn power from the military to the police. So this idea that, well, if we just diversify the police, that automatically will increase sensitivity and everything else is just not true.
And what does the data show about the non-white law enforcement officers? Because you're talking about women, but what happens when countries around the world, governments around the world are trying to get more non-white law enforcement officers in their police squads?
The research in the US and the UK that I'm most familiar with is not at all encouraging. It does not show any robust improvements in the metrics that would really matter, like use of force, frequency of arrests. Sometimes residents in Black communities will report feeling a little better about the police, but that's about producing legitimacy, not really about producing more substantive justice.
Which is actually what, for example, the U.S. government says it's the goal of the diversity program of the U.S. Different police forces. They say it increases trust and legitimacy, and I'm quoting, right? So the goal is not really to reduce ill treatment, but to create trust. Is that fair?
That's a fair assessment, but it doesn't produce fairness. So this is sometimes what we refer to as procedural justice, which is the idea that if we make the police more professional, more law-abiding, less biased, better at communication, that the public will feel better about the outcome of their interactions with the police, even if they end up getting a ticket or getting arrested. And sometimes people do feel better about this, but that doesn't mean that more justice has been achieved. So a kinder, gentler war on drugs is still a completely unjust undertaking. And giving narcotics units anti-bias training is not really the solution to that problem. We need to look at the legal regime that is being enforced by the police that is producing this unjustness, even when it is performed more courteously and more professionally and by more black and brown police officers.
The use of body cameras was authorized by the Portuguese Parliament last year. They're video recording devices attached to law enforcement uniforms, which must be turned on whenever an agent resorts to force. At this point, they're not a reality yet. They'll be implemented at the discretion of the government, but there's legislation put in place that makes this could make this a reality. Legislation like this is in place also in the US, in the UK, Spain. France is also implementing this as we speak. How effective are body cams?
For whom? They're effective often at protecting police from claims of misconduct, but they have not produced more accountability for police. New technology is only going to be as effective as the mechanisms and desires to produce accountability are that are in place. So all the time now in the United States, we see problematic body camera footage, but it still doesn't result in the prosecution of police officers, the production of guilty pleas. And ironically, the most important videos that have sometimes led to something, at least, were taken by the public, not by the police. We see the police refusing to release the videos, editing them, saying they weren't properly recorded, turning their cameras off. And they take the point of view of the police, which is not always the point of view that's most relevant here, where it might be the point of view of someone who was shot, for instance, or an independent angle. So I think that it is a mistake to imagine that we're going to get some significant change in policing as a result of this. Might it lead to an individual officer here or there receiving some sort of discipline? It is possible that could happen, but there's also not much reason to think that this will fundamentally change the nature of policing. Again, if our political leadership is telling the police to micromanage the lives of the poor, undocumented, etc., then they will use the techniques of violence and coercion that are central to policing, and the existence of body cameras really won't affect that meaningfully. I'll just give one more example. Look at the way protest policing happens. We routinely see video of human rights abuses at political mobilizations by the police where there are no consequences because the police are doing what the politicians wanted them to do, which is to suppress these movements, to prevent them from producing real disruption of everyday life or threatening institutions. So the political leaders want the police to perform those functions, and so they will look the other way regardless of how terrible the video looks.
But even the CPT asked for this. So the committee from the Council of Europe we were just mentioning asked for it. It reads in their report, the one I mentioned from 2018, the experience of other countries demonstrates that issuing body-worn video cameras to law enforcement officials and their systematic use during any incidents represents an additional safeguard against abuse by officials, as well as the protection against unfounded allegations of ill treatment. Is the CPT looking at different data?
I don't think they're really looking at data. I think they're looking at discourse, right? They're often, this is a discourse that they're engaged in that's rooted in a kind of legal formalism. These are lawyers talking about a mythic idea of what the police do, what the law does, and how accountability works. And it all looks very good on paper. More transparency equals more accountability equals more justice. But this has very little to do with the actual lived experience of policing, which many of these lawyers know very little about. They see what happens in a courtroom. They look at trial transcripts. They hear from witnesses, but they don't really experience policing in heavily policed communities and see the ways in which legal violations are not an aberration, they are the norm. How much of what the police do every day is at best only loosely related to something in the statute books. They're producing order and using violence and coercion to accomplish that. And adding body cameras into the mix isn't really going to change that equation.
In its current strategy document, PSP, the Portuguese police force for the most populated urban areas in the country, makes proximity policing one of its 5 acting principles. They claim the proximity between officers and population allows for, and I'm quoting, solidify mutual bonds of trust, consolidating the social perception of the legitimacy of police action, which is decisive in the gathering of useful information regarding threats and vulnerabilities which in some way affect citizens. Is this a good sign?
This is what we call community policing in the United States. It's this idea that, if we embed the police more effectively into the community, that they'll be able to gather intelligence on who the bad guys are, figure out who the vulnerable populations are, et cetera. But this is, again, largely about myth-making in order to produce legitimacy for policing. We always see calls for community policing emerge in the wake of a legitimacy crisis, like the Rodney King riots in the early 1990s in Los Angeles, the response to what happened to Amadou Diallo in the late 90s in New York City, after George Floyd in Minneapolis, after Mike Brown. And this is when we hear, don't worry, we're going to give you community policing now. One of the fundamental problems with community policing is that the premise is that the community should bring its problems to the police so that they can work out solutions. We can find out who's doing what and come up with a solution. But what tools do police have to solve our community problems? Handcuffs, guns, pepper spray, water cannons, right? Ticket books, threats. These are the tools they have to solve community problems, more coercion and violence. Do they have access to stable housing? Do they have access to mental health services, drug treatment on demand? Do they have access to youth programs that lead to stable employees? They don't have any of those things. So we don't need community policing. What we need is investments in communities, real economic opportunities, economic stability, income stability, high quality, access to high quality. These are the things communities need to be safe, not more people with guns walking on every street corner, talking to everyone in the community.
Explain the history of broken windows policing and how this is tied to community policing in the US, but also its influence in policing methods around the world.
So broken windows policing emerges in the early 1980s as an ideological intervention. It was not a piece of research. It was published in a popular magazine, not in a research journal. It was a political intervention brought forward by some of the most conservative thinkers in the United States. It was a response to the successes of our civil rights movement, and it was an attempt to justify a radical expansion of policing into the everyday lives of poor and marginalized and racialized populations. The broken windows theory, again, without any evidence or testing, claims that the problems of urban America are too much moral deregulation, that we've allowed people to behave badly in public spaces. And this has given rise not just to some public drinking and public urination, but to murders and rapes and armed robberies and the decline of whole neighborhoods as a result. Rather than discussing the ways in which the United States systematically divested from those communities through government austerity, but also the ways in which housing markets, labor markets also divested from those communities at the same time, lending markets. And so these communities were losing jobs, losing services, and surprisingly, then you have some disorder and crime. And here comes the broken windows theory that says all that disorder and crime, that's because these are immoral people. And the way we fix them is to put a police officer on every street corner, follow them around, write them tickets, make threats, until they learn to become upstanding citizens. We're not going to provide them with any investment, any jobs, any social programs, any health care. We're just going to follow them around with police all day.
And you go after minor, small,
every little minor
acts.
Misbehavior that's a sign of their moral inferiority. It's the perfect kind of colonial strategy, counterinsurgency strategy. People have been left out. They are resisting formally and informally. And so the way to prevent that from having an effect on those who are on the winning end of these new arrangements is to use the police to micromanage their behavior, to constantly threaten and arrest them, which of course is part of what drove mass incarceration in the United States.
Portuguese anthropologist Susana Durão writes in her book Esquadra de Polícia, meaning police station, published in 2016, and I'm quoting, "The community policing experiment in Portugal won over journalists and most mass media, fundamentally serving to popularize PSP in democratic Portugal." Is community policing a marketing stunt?
Yes, community policing is it's part a marketing stunt and part an intensification of policing in already highly policed communities. So again, we see the emergence of community policing primarily when there has been a legitimacy crisis, a high-profile killing, a riot, some other issue that causes people to question the motives of the police. And the police then go on a PR spree and say, don't worry, here are 6 really nice police officers. One of them is even black. And they're very good at talking to people. And they go to a lot of community meetings. And they're just here to help. Ignoring everything else that police do and the way in which that community policing just feeds into the divestment of those communities and the replacing of social services with ever more intensive and invasive policing.
But the fact is that when you talk to law enforcement officers, and I've been also interviewing dozens of law enforcement officers in the last year maybe, they tell you that the local communities of poor neighborhoods are the ones calling the police for their safety against the, quote, bad guys. Does your stance against community policing come from a place of privilege?
So part of the problem here is that these communities, right, have lost access to basic services, have lost access to the global flows of capital and employment and wealth. And then they've been told the only government resource that's available to you now when you have a problem is policing. And they've been told this for decades. And then when they ask for help from the police say, see, that proves they love police. But when they ask for, could we have a community center for our young people? Could we have more secure housing? Could we have better healthcare clinics in our community? They're told, oh, no, we can never afford those things. These things are not possible. The government has no money, right? And so, but if you want more police, you can just ask for more police and we'll give you more police. So to say that these communities want help is obvious. They need help. But to say that the only help they want is police is to accept this false choice of policing or nothing. And what we find is that when we work with communities to give them choices other than just policing or nothing, policing very quickly falls to the bottom of the list of things they want, once they really have a sense that they could have other things. And in the United States, the movement for police abolition is coming from exactly people in these very high crime communities, but who have had this understanding available to them that they could have something other than just police.
In the early 90s, the Portuguese government launched a program called Escola Segura. The translation would be Safe School. It had the goal of improving, and I'm quoting, objective and subjective security levels in schools. The program is still in place today as part of the overall community policing efforts, with agents guaranteeing safety in schools and their surroundings. That's the wording police uses, giving lessons to students and school security security issues, and, quote, fostering civics and citizenship and attempting to eradicate risky and illicit behaviors. I'm quoting the program. Why do we bring armed people with the monopoly of violence inside schools to deal with young students?
To produce police legitimacy. That's the primary purpose of that, right? The first school police in the United States were located in elementary schools, not because the elementary schools were violent, dangerous places, but because the purpose of that school policing was to teach children that police are heroes, they're here to solve all your problems, and that you should respect authority figures, that you should not complain, you should not make trouble, you should not resist. You should not organize for power. You should do what the police tell you to do. And so bringing police into schools is about expanding police authority, which is ultimately about expanding state authority in an environment where huge numbers of people are being left out of the wealth of society, out of real economic and political power. So we should view this incursion of policing into the lives of children as a deeply problematic kind of counterinsurgency. What are we doing to empower children to make good decisions? What are we doing to give children real pathways for producing autonomy so that they don't need authoritarian figures telling them what to do?
You also have a chapter of your book, The End of Policing, called The School to Prison Pipeline. What do you mean by that?
Well, in the United States, beginning in the 1990s primarily, we had some before, we saw this massive expansion in the placement of armed police officers in our schools at all levels. And what this has done is it has criminalized children. And we have seen huge numbers of children accused of disciplinary, problems driven into the criminal legal system in ways that have had long-term, measurable negative consequences in their lives. And this burden has fallen primarily on non-white students, students with disabilities, and LGBTQ, or gender non-conforming students of various kinds. And this has been a remarkably destructive project of undermining the well-being of children in the absence of any data that it makes them safer. All the research shows it does nothing to improve the safety of children.
Does policing need to be reformed?
So policing is a harmful enterprise that produces all kinds of abuses. The question is, what's the most effective way of reducing that level of harm and abuse? So police reform, in quotation marks, is one approach, rooted in this kind of procedural justice mindset that says that if we just make them more professional and law-abiding, that this will produce better outcomes, that there will be more justice. But I think this is an incredibly misguided undertaking that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of policing and really serves only to re-legitimate systems of social control rooted in exploitation. So I don't think we need to reform the police. I think we need to develop alternative systems of producing well-being, safety for people, safety from interpersonal violence, safety from environmental pollution, safety from climate change, safety from predatory banking practices, safety from products that are designed to harm us by the producers that make them. We need a lot of different ways of producing safety. And policing turns out to be one of the least effective and most harmful ways of attempting that.
But then when you read your book, the first sentence of the concluding chapter is policing needs to be reformed. Are you a reformist?
No, and we actually changed that in the new English language edition because it was confusing, I think. What I was really trying to say is that, yes, policing is broken in the sense that it is filled with harmful aspects, but even if we really wanted to reform police, it's just not possible in the ways that people imagine. And, look in the United States, after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the uprising that followed, we were told, policing was going to get fixed. President Obama created a commission that sounds very similar to the one here that was filled with all these great ideas for reform. Well, the officers who were involved in the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis years later had all those reforms. They'd had implicit bias training, were wearing body cameras, had de-escalation training, were operating under new, more restrictive use of force policies, and none of it made any difference. And today, the police continue to kill the same number of people every day as they did before Mike Brown was killed, about 3 Americans a day. So where is the evidence that all this police reform is making policing in the U.S. any better? We don't have any evidence.
Are reforming police and abolishing police mutually exclusive?
So are there steps we could take to reduce police power that don't immediately result in the elimination of policing? Yes, we could pass more restrictions on the kinds of weapons they have available. Water cannons, rubber bullets, tear gas, high magazine, handguns. So these are ways of reducing police power that aren't intended to expand police powers, the scope of policing, the legitimacy of policing, etc. But ultimately, my view is that we should concentrate our efforts, use our limited political capital to demand alternatives to policing in as many arenas as we possibly can. We don't need nicer school police. We don't need better trained school police. We don't need school police to be mentors and give anti-drug training. We need more school counselors, more teachers' aides, more coaches.
And the end of policing?
Well, that is how we achieve the end of policing, is by replacing those police functions with other kinds of interventions that aren't rooted in control, coercion, and violence.
Portuguese anthropologist Susana Durão, I mentioned her before a few minutes back, told us in an interview, if we fully refrain from delegating public security functions on specific state institutions, we run the risk of having an aggressive privatization, because the privatization will happen, whether we want it or not. There is the possibility of degenerating into warlords, militias, or paid and well-paid private security. There is a greater possibility of creating social injustice without the police than with it. Is abolitionism against equality?
No, I completely reject that analysis. That is not an analysis that is rooted at all in what police abolitionists are saying. The point of police abolition is not to just somehow magically make the police disappear and then see what happens, all other things being equal. The point is to change the underlying conditions that call for policing interventions. So this means that we have to look at functions that we have turned over to police and figure out alternative ways of addressing those concerns, because the concerns are real. So,
Angela Davis says abolition is not primarily a negative strategy. It's not primarily about dismantling, getting rid of, but it's about re-envisioning. It's about building anew.
That's right. And Ruthie Wilson Gilmore says the same thing. Abolition is about creating. So what we're trying to do is to create more economic and social and political justice. So dismantling the regimes of exploitation, the abandonment of communities by both capital and government. We want more social programs. We want more social control of capital, of investment. We want to see people have access to safe, stable housing, adequate incomes, high-quality health care, so that they aren't engaged in the kinds of behaviors that get labeled as crime and then turned over to police to manage. So, if we look at what police actually do day in and day out, they're not chasing bank robbers or finding serial killers, right? They're micromanaging the lives of the poorest and most socially marginalized communities in our society.
But how would we then stop bank robbers and serial killers without police?
Well, so we have a massive infrastructure of policing right now. And what we need to do is we need to begin to replace it with alternatives and to retract those police functions. So we start with the things that are most obvious. Getting the police out of the drug business, which Portugal has made some important strides towards doing, and civilization did not collapse. We need to get them out of the mental health business. We need to get them out of schools. We need to get them out of homelessness management. We need to get them out of sex work management. And we need to create new avenues for people to have safe, secure livings. As we do that, we then look at what's left. People shooting each other, armed robberies. Okay, well, what's driving those behaviors? What can we do to create alternatives to that? It's about a process of exploration, experimentation. It does not happen overnight, and we see what's left. But we understand what guides this process is an understanding that policing is an inherently harmful, problematic institution, and that we should do everything we can to reasonably reduce its impact on society.
Does a world without police also mean a world without prisons and without laws and without states?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that folks definitely make a connection with prisons. No one goes to prison unless they've been arrested by the police. So police abolition and prison abolition are closely related. Is it a world without laws or without states? Well, I think I want to live in a complex society. I like traveling. I like being able to buy products from other places. I like to have technology available in my life. And with that is going to come some social conflict and inequalities. And we need systems to help manage all that. But are they rooted in regimes of exploitation? And I'll just give you a Portuguese example, right? When the Portuguese explorers first arrive in India, it is not an explicit project of conquest. It's a project of trade. To some degree, trade between equals. They have products that Portugal wanted. Portugal had things they wanted. It was an exchange. It was not a military operation. So I want to have systems of exchange, of communication. What I don't want is military adventurism, abusive policing, backing up regimes of super exploitation.
Which was what happened with Portugal.
Which is what eventually happens, right? So eventually that trade turns into a project of conquest.
But is the abolition of policing the beginning of the end of the state?
Possibly, or certainly the state as we understand it now, right?
And is that what you call for? Do you consider yourself an anarchist?
Well, I'm certainly influenced by anti-authoritarian ideas. I have a lot of sympathy. But there is a definite sense in which the book actually gives an important role to the state as a mechanism for helping us overcome some of the social inequalities we have. So I think it is possible to harness the state for more progressive projects to actually help us produce more equality. And I think when we look at some of the huge challenges we face, like climate change, we're going to need a state that's capable of regulating capital, regulating emissions on a global scale. Is it the state we have today? Not necessarily. Do we need more global forms of governments? Do we need those forms of governments to be more accountable to populations and not corporations? Yes, obviously.
Are there examples of communities without police?
Well, people go back and forth about this, looking at different communal kinds of systems. And is there policing? There are systems of regulation. Are there armed public police? There are places where they have attempted to, reduce their reliance on some things, something like that. It's very hard, though, to do that as an island in a sea of capitalism, in a sea of militarism. So what we see is that when people do attempt to carve out more autonomous, self-regulated spaces, they're under tremendous external pressure, which drives them back into some of these social control mechanisms. So unfortunately, you look at a situation like Cuba even, which is a kind of attempt at a workers' revolution, high level of social and economic equality, but constant pressure, even invasions from the United States, so that then policing emerges to look for spies and political dissidents, and a paranoia which is not unfounded kind of sets in. And so do you have a kind of utopian situation in Cuba? No, you don't. There's no freedom of the press. There are no bookstores. There's no sharing of ideas.
And it is also highly policed
And
society.
It's highly policed, right.
But are there examples of, what would be the other examples? Like communities like, for example, Rojava in the Kurdistan or the Zapatistas in Mexico.
So they're certainly trying.
Are those the examples you were mentioning that
those are
trying?
Examples of people attempting to do something like that, but they're also under tremendous external pressure, right? And so they have armed militias, armies, et cetera, that are trying to defend these places, but that also sometimes get caught up in what feels more like domestic policing. So I don't have any illusions that there are some utopian examples that we can just emulate. These are going to be long-term, pretty radical transformations.
Then how are we supposed to believe that ending the police is possible?
Well, we don't need to accept some kind of utopian endpoint. What I try to make clear throughout the book is that abolition is an analysis about the nature of policing and the systems of exploitation that it's connected to that guides the way we make decisions right now. We have a choice to make. Should we spend more money on community mental health services or more money on police training to respond to mental health crises? Well, an abolitionist analysis makes that choice very easy. We should spend it on community-based mental health services. We have a choice to make. Should we send more police into our schools to produce order and respect for authority? Or should we hire more social workers, counselors, bring parents and community members into the school to help produce those things? An abolitionist analysis helps us make that decision. These are not decisions about some long, far away imagined future. These are decisions we need to make right now.
Thank you so much, Alex Vitale.
You're most welcome.
Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, o Nuno Viegas fez a edição, o Bernardo Afonso foi responsável pelo som, fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaça Danilo Tomás, Fred Rocha, Joana Batista, Luís Marquês, Margarida David Cardoso, Maria Almeida e Pedro Miguel Santos. A música é dos Lotus Fever. Queremos fazer do Fumaça a primeira redação profissional totalmente financiada pelas pessoas. Se queres fazer parte da nossa comunidade, vai a fumaca.pt/contribuir. Até já.